So serious about the protest movement.
Yes, they are.
But they were so flippant that they were singing a happy-go-lucky song, which happens to be one I wrote. And I'm glad they sang it. And when I get there, I'll sing it with them. When I get in.
When we think of the great feuds in John Lennon's life, we all think we know the story. It's a tale of two titans, Lennon and McCartney, the creative geniuses who built a universe of sound only to watch it crumble under the weight of ego, business, and what felt like a brotherly betrayal. Their war of words, fought in the grooves of their solo albums, is the stuff of rock and roll legend. Then there's the other name, the one that marks the tragic end of the story, Mark David Chapman, a name that's become synonymous with obsession and senseless violence. So it's only natural to assume that the person who sparked Lennon's deepest rage would be one of those two, the partner who broke his heart, or the stranger who stole his future. But what if that assumption, the one we've all bought into for decades, is wrong? What if the person who caused John Lennon the most consistent, private anguish wasn't a rival or a killer at all? What if it was someone much, much closer? This isn't a story about a public feud played out in the pages of Rolling Stone. This is about a private war, a conflict Lennon fueled with his own demons, one that haunted him right up to his final days. It's the story of a relationship that, unlike his partnership with Paul, produced no chart-topping hits, only a quiet, echoing pain. While the world obsessed over the public battles of a rock god, the most significant conflict in John Lennon's life was happening behind closed doors. It was a struggle defined not by competing albums, but by years of silence, not by angry interviews, but by agonizing distance. The person at the center of this storm wasn't a peer or an enemy, but his own blood. Forget what you think you know about Lennon's rivalries. The untold story, the one that reveals the deepest cracks in his soul, is the story of John and his first son, Julian. To really understand the depth of that private anguish, first we have to look at the public rage. The breakup of the Beatles wasn't just a band splitting up, it was a cultural earthquake, and at the epicenter were John and Paul, two halves of a singular genius, now torn apart. For John, the end of the band he started felt like a betrayal, and he lashed out with the only weapons he had, his words and his music. In a sprawling, no-holds-barred interview with Rolling Stone in 1971, John didn't just pull back the curtain, he lit the whole stage on fire. He called Paul's first solo album, McCartney, rubbish. He dismantled the very myth he helped create, famously declaring, "I don't believe in Beatles, I just believe in me, Yoko and me. That's reality." Each word was a calculated punch, designed to wound the man he once called his brother. Paul felt the sting. He said John's words were like hurtful barbs being flung his way. On his album Ram, Paul threw a few jabs of his own. In the song, "Too Many People," he sang, "You took your lucky break and broke it in two." It was a clear shot at John, a subtle but sharp accusation. John, who was never known for subtlety, didn't just return fire. He launched a full-scale musical assault. The result was How Do You Sleep?, a song from his Imagine album that is one of the most vicious diss tracks in music history. With George Harrison, another Beatle who felt overshadowed by Paul, playing a searing slide guitar, John unleashed hell. "So Sgt. Pepper took you by surprise," he sneered, mocking the album many saw as Paul's masterpiece. "The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you've gone, you're just another day." This was a brutal surgical strike, dismissing Paul's entire post-Beatles career while turning his most famous ballad against him. The attack was so personal that even people in the studio were shocked. But for John, it was a necessary exorcism. He later admitted it wasn't a terrible, vicious, horrible vendetta, but said, "I used my resentment against Paul to create a song." This public war was fueled by everything that made the Beatles great: passion, competition, and a deep, complicated love. They were rivals, sure, but they were rivals who had shared an incredible journey. Theirs was a feud between equals, arguing over art, money, and leadership. The pain was real, but it was the pain of a partnership dissolving. It was loud, it was public, and eventually, it started to heal. Before his death, they were speaking again, the anger cooling into a wary but familiar affection. But this public spectacle, this war of the rock titans, was also a dramatic distraction. It drew the world's attention, leaving another, more profound conflict to fester in the shadows. The anger John aimed at Paul was the anger of a brother. The anguish he carried for someone else was the anguish of a father, and it was rooted in a pain so deep it started long before he was ever famous. To understand why John Lennon was capable of putting so much emotional distance between himself and his own son, you have to understand the blueprint of abandonment he was handed as a child. John's entire childhood was a lesson in loss. His father, Alfred Lennon, was a merchant seaman, a ghost who was absent for John's birth and most of his early life. Alf was a fleeting presence, until one day he forced a 5-year-old John to make an impossible choice, him or his mother. In a moment of terror, John first chose his father, but seeing his mother walk away in tears, he ran back to her. It was a primal scene of loyalty and loss that scarred him forever. But his mother, Julia, was a restless spirit herself, not quite equipped for single motherhood. She was fun and vivacious, but also unstable. Eventually, she handed John over, to be raised by her stern, formidable sister, Mimi. So John lost his mother for the first time. He grew up in Mimi's rigid home, a place that offered stability, but little of the maternal warmth he craved. As a teenager, he finally reconnected with Julia. She was the one who bought him his first guitar and encouraged his rebellious, artistic side. For a few precious years he had a mother again. And then, in 1958, when John was just 17, she was killed in a car accident just a short walk from Mimi's house. He lost her for a second and final time. These weren't just sad events in a backstory. They were the traumas that built the man. John learned a brutal lesson over and over. The people you love disappear. This pattern of loss created a deep-seated fear of abandonment that never truly healed. It came out as a desperate clinginess in his relationships and a cruel, reflexive anger when he felt insecure. He later admitted to hitting his first wife, Cynthia, in a fit of jealousy, a rage born from a lifetime of being left behind. This was the man who, at the height of Beatlemania, became a father. A man who'd never really had a father, who'd lost his mother twice, and who was now expected to give the unconditional love he'd never known himself. He was being asked to break a cycle he didn't even fully understand. The stage was set, not for a rock and roll fairy tale, but for a tragic repeat of the past. In the whirlwind of 1962, as the Beatles were about to conquer the world, Cynthia Powell discovered she was pregnant. For John, a man-child still dealing with his own broken childhood, the news wasn't a joy, but a problem. They married out of a sense of duty, a shotgun wedding for a rock star so focused on his career that he played a gig on his own wedding night. Julian Lennon was born on April 8, 1963. His father, one of the most famous men on the planet, showed up 3 days later. His first words to his son were almost a prophecy. Who's going to be a famous little rocker like his dad then? It framed Julian not as a son, but as an extension of his own fame. The early years were a blur of touring and recording. John was mostly an absent father, a face on TV. In the rare moments he was home, there were flashes of family life. Julian remembered those days with a sad fondness, later recalling, "As a kid, I thought my dad was pretty happy. With the family home, and his place in the world. Who could have predicted that everything was about to change? The change was Yoko Ono." In 1968, Cynthia came home to find John with Yoko in their house. The marriage was over. For 5-year-old Julian, it was more than a divorce. It was a vanishing act. His father didn't just move out. He was erased from his life. Suddenly, my dad literally disappeared off the face of the planet, Julian said. Decades later, the pain still raw. He and Yoko Ono were deeply and publicly in love, and I felt as if my mum and I had been cast aside. The abandonment was swift and total. While John launched a new, public life of peace and love with his new partner, his first family was left behind. He was so consumed by his new world that he seemed to have no room for the old one. The contrast was stark, and for Julian, incredibly confusing. His father was preaching universal love to the world while denying it to his own son. It was Paul McCartney, of all people, who stepped in. Seeing the pain of Cynthia and young Julian, Paul drove out to visit them. On the way, he started writing a song of comfort for the little boy who'd lost his dad. The song, first called Hey Jules, became Hey Jude, an anthem of solace for millions, born from a moment of personal heartbreak. As John himself later acknowledged, Paul wrote it for Julian. For years after the split, the silence from John was deafening. Julian recalled that they barely spoke. The boy who had his father's face, his voice, and his talent was effectively an orphan with a world-famous living father. This wasn't a feud. A feud needs two people. This was a complete and devastating withdrawal, an emotional amputation that would define Julian's life. To the world, John Lennon in the early 1970s was a new man. He'd shed his mop-top skin and emerged as a prophet of peace, an activist. Artist challenging the world with anthems like Give Peace a Chance and Imagine. He and Yoko were a living art piece, using their fame to demand a more loving world. But for his son, Julian, this public persona was a bitter joke. The disconnect between the man singing about universal brotherhood and the father, who had vanished, was a canyon of hypocrisy. He laid this pain bare in an interview years later. From my point of view, I felt he was a hypocrite, Julian said. Dad could talk about peace and love out loud to the world, but he could never show it to the people who supposedly meant the most to him, his wife and son. How can you talk about peace and love and have a family in bits and pieces, no communication, adultery, divorce? The criticism was brutally accurate. How could a man who imagined a world with nothing to kill or die for be so emotionally destructive to his own child? John wasn't totally blind to this, though his acknowledgments were often wrapped in a cold, self-justifying tone. In a famous interview with Playboy shortly before his death, he made a cruel distinction between his two sons. Sean is a planned child, and therein lies the difference, he said. I don't love Julian any less as a child. He's still my son, whether he came from a bottle of whiskey or because they didn't have pills in those days. He's here, he belongs to me, and he always will. That bottle of whiskey line was a moment of shocking public cruelty. To reduce your son's existence to a drunken accident is a deep wound, and it exposed the baggage John carried. Julian wasn't just a son. He was a living reminder of a life John had thrown away, a marriage he felt trapped in, a version of himself he no longer wanted to be. This inner turmoil often came out as anger. Julian has talked about his father being verbally aggressive and yelling at him for seemingly no reason. This wasn't simple anger. It was the chaotic rage of a man at war with himself, projecting his own self-loathing onto the person who was his most vulnerable mirror. The anguish for John was real, but it was self-inflicted. It was the pain of a man who knew, on some level, that he was failing. He once gave advice that sounds like a tragic confession. You can't cheat kids. If you cheat them when they're children, they'll make you pay by revolting against you or hating you. John Lennon, the peace advocate, knew exactly what he was withholding. He just couldn't bring himself to give it. The wall of silence separating John and Julian finally started to crack in 1973. John and Yoko separated for a period. John called his lost weekend, an 18-month stretch in Los Angeles with their personal assistant, May Pang. This period is often seen as a blur of booze and rock star excess. But for Julian Lennon, it was something else, a new beginning. It was Maypang who pushed John to reconnect with his son. Free from the complex dynamics of his life with Yoko, John started to reach out. For the first time in years, Julian, now a young teen, started visiting his father. Those visits were often awkward. There was so much lost time to make up for. A family friend noted they had to build a relationship from scratch because they hardly knew each other. Julian himself described wanting to run up and grab him and hold him, but said John didn't know how to handle that kind of affection. Still, in the middle of the awkwardness, real connection started to grow. They took trips to Disneyland. John started seeing Julian not just as a symbol of his past, but as a person with his own burgeoning musical talent. He bought Julian a guitar and taught him chords. For a brief moment, they were just a father and son bonding over the one language they both understood, music. Julian even played drums on Ya Ya, a track on his dad's 1974 album Walls and Bridges. The lost weekend was, ironically, when Julian found his father again. It proved a relationship was possible. John could be, in Julian's words, charming, funny and warm. But this hopeful chapter had an end date. When John reconciled with Yoko and returned to New York in 1975, the dynamic shifted again. The birth of his second son, Sean, later that year, accidentally pushed Julian back to the sidelines. John famously became a house husband, determined to do it right this time. But in his mission to be the perfect father to Sean, he once again highlighted his failures with Julian. The thaw was over, and the glimmer of hope was overshadowed by a new family, leaving Julian once again on the outside looking in. The last 5 years of John Lennon's life were a study in contrasts. To the world, he was a recluse, baking bread, and raising his son Sean in the Dakota, a quiet family man. But this picture-perfect fatherhood cast a long, painful shadow over his relationship with Julian. The devotion he gave Sean was a constant reminder of the attention Julian never got. Visits became more tense. Julian later described his jealousy watching his father dote on Sean in a way he never had. He was a teenager now, and he understood the emotional reality of the situation. He saw a father who was present and engaged in a way he'd never been for him. The pain was immense. "I had to control the aggression I inherited from my dad," Julian admitted, about the complex feelings those visits brought up. Still, they were trying. In the final year of John's life, he was making real attempts to rebuild that fragile bridge. It was difficult for both of them. As Julian said in an interview, "I probably knew him as much as I know you. That's about how warm it was. There were cuddles now and then, but there was always an uneasy tension. Yet something was shifting. In what would be their final phone conversation, Julian felt a change. John was buzzing with a renewed creative energy that would produce his final album, Double Fantasy. He sounded different. I just remember that as being the last kind of moments, listening to him being extremely happy in a happy place and doing what he loved, Julian recalled years later. The music that he played me at that particular point, just like starting over. I was very happy for him and looking forward to seeing him again. John himself seemed to feel a new chapter was possible. In that same Playboy interview, after the cruel bottle of whiskey remark, he added a note of hope. "Julian and I will have a relationship in the future." It was a promise of a reconciliation that was just starting to feel real. But there was no future. There would be no more conversations, no more chances to bridge the gap. On December 8, 1980, that phone call became the final word. The fragile connection they were starting to weave was severed forever. Julian was left not just with the grief of losing a father, but with the grief of losing the father he was just starting to find. The story of John and Julian Lennon is a powerful reminder that the most public lives often hide the most private pains. It's a story that gets lost behind the headlines of rock and roll feuds. If this deep dive into the complexities of John Lennon's life resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more untold stories from music history. And let us know in the comments, does understanding this relationship change how you see John Lennon as an artist and a man? So, who did John Lennon truly hate before he died? In the end, the answer isn't a person. It was never about Paul McCartney. Their rivalry was born of a deep competitive love. It certainly wasn't about his killer, a stranger whose hate was a one-way street. The person who caused John the most private anguish was the one who reflected his own deepest failures back at him, his first son, Julian. Their relationship was the battlefield for all of John's demons. His fear of abandonment, a product of his own childhood, ironically led him to abandon his son. The rage he felt at the world was too often aimed at a child who just wanted his father's love. Julian wasn't an enemy. He was a mirror. In Julian's eyes, John saw the ghost of his own father. He saw the irresponsible young man he used to be. He saw the hypocrisy of his message of peace clashing with the reality of his own emotional chaos. The distance, the anger. It was all a defense against his own profound personal shame. In the end, this isn't a story about hate. It's a far more tragic and human story about pain. The pain of a cycle passed from one generation to the next. John Lennon, the man who lost his father, became a lost father himself. And the greatest tragedy is that in his final days, he was finally starting to find his way back. He was, in his own words, just like starting over. But time ran out, leaving a son with a lifetime of questions and a world left to wonder about the peace that John Lennon so desperately sought for everyone, but could never quite give to the one who needed it most.